After everything that happened, the human students in the academy continued to be incredibly reclusive. So much so that they never answered any question unless asked directly. They never joined a club, and if they were in one, they immediately withdrew themselves from it. They're never seen in person outside their domiciles, and never ever without their suits. The only way of knowing anything about them is to speak with their mates. The mates of all different species seem euphoric for a while whenever they leave the domicile of a human. Then there seems to be something off. At first it was subtle, but most everyone could see it. Eventually, they couldn't stop but see there seems to be some sort of transformation. To each species, it was different. One commonality, though, was increased awareness, cognitive abilities. Being able to pass every class with perfect grades was surprising, especially for certain students in certain species. Although, aside from that, there's always a difference, and the differences are as follows. With a feline tabby, she seemed to get taller. It wasn't confirmed at first, but sure enough she was. She also became more curvaceous, and her hair seemed to be thin aside from her tail and paws. So thin, in fact, that you would think she's going bald, but no, it's just very, very thin and baby fine. Her skin, which you could see, became extremely pale to the point of being near solid white. She also stood much straighter and moved more elegant, almost never on all fours like she did before. The insectoid reptilians named gills had seemed to have more smoother scales and seem more flexible too. They're not rough anymore, and they also seem to have a more human-ish appearance. They already looked very human to start with, but now it's almost as though the scales were turning into skin, and even though they had no hair, it was almost just strange to see this. The very short and pale species known as the laddie seemed to only get taller and more statuesque, which is a word that the humans came up with. It seemed as though the laddie, even though a very, very petite species, which at first was actually called a midget or halfling by the humans, but they decided to just adjust the name and decided they wouldn't insult them. They usually walked almost waddled in a way, but now those that seemed to be with the humans a lot are now straighter, taller, leaner almost. It was odd to see them standing next to each other, one that had a human mate and one that didn't. You would think they're almost a different species. The reptilian Slick, the teacher and her now husband, seemed to be built up in different ways, of course, as it seems her body gained girth in, as the humans put it, all the right places, as her husband seemed to build more muscle, almost as though all of the little fat he had actually trimmed down or been transmutated into muscle. He was doing more exercises, of course, because he seemed to have way more energy, and of course, so did she. Yet she always had this strange look like she was always satiated. They both seemed to gain more control over their thin appendages, too. Her tentacles were able to reach out and grasp things she wouldn't before, seemingly have more control over them and more power behind them as well. Not to mention, there was that full dexterity they had as well. Her tendrils on her head seemed to flow, almost as though every single time she thought of something, they would move in a certain way. Whenever they asked about the humans, you would always see them slick back and kind of point out the back as kind of a sense of that feels good situation. Her mate just doesn't have tentacles, of course. His tendrils do something similar, but his tendrils are much, much shorter. His tails, however, that's a different story. Usually the slick tail is very lean and more of a show than anything else, though it can be used a little bit as a weapon. Now, now it's extremely strong to the point where he can actually grab a hold of something and pull his own body weight up towards the ceiling. Everyone was amazed by this and couldn't understand how is he able to do that. Nobody else in your own species can do that. What the hell is going on? The insectoid shells became more and more hourglass shaped each time they molted. They molt several times a human year, but it seemed as though it was becoming more and more common. Another thing that changed was that very bulbous abdomen that seemed to stick out towards the back. Well, it seemed to shrink in size. And this was surprising. It was no longer getting in anyone's way. People used to actually worry about being smacked by it every time they turned, but no, now it was quite manageable. One of the biggest changes happened is that they now have a lot of muscle going to their much larger wings. And now they actually have 3 sets of wings instead of 2. How is this even possible? They didn't understand, but now the shells can simply whip around an area so fast that now they're not so bulbous. They're quite lean, and with the extra wings, the speed that they can move just surprises everybody. Although a few incidents happens where once they actually grew these extra wings, they didn't realize how fast they were moving, and sometimes stopping encounters crashing into someone or something, which usually left all the students smiling, pointing, laughing, and eventually the shell simply getting up, dusting off, and, as much pride as they can, walk into class. The reptilian Bly got much sleeker. The sharp edges of their scales seemed to dull to the point of being almost unnoticeable. With each of their molting, which they do once or maybe twice a year at most, they didn't lose height and they still stayed the tallest species there, but they gained much more accentuated features. This included the tongue that nearly doubled in length. They're insectivores, of course, and they do eat very large insects, so having a large tongue was important, but now it was not only longer, but it was stronger. And with that, they also looked at the musculature seemingly pushing against the scales. Usually, Bly were very lean. They had a few bumps, and of course there, so you could tell the males from the females, but that was about it. But now, with the accentuated parts, you could definitely tell. Everyone, from the staff to the students, is amazed by this transformation. But what's more amazing is the fact that every single one of these are at the top of their class. And this includes exceeding at physical sports. In some cases, there's claims that it's too unfair for others. There was claim that they were genetically engineering themselves to try and give themselves an advantage. But no, check after check after check showed that they were not taking any type of performance enhancers at all. It was crazy. One would think, though, that the squid and the hawks would be angry for missing out on all this extra that's happening across other species. However, those that lost control with the 3 boys did not exactly lose out. The few hawks that got in on that seemed to get stronger and their wings got wider. The most noticeable effect, though, was the fact that their feather coloration became much brighter, much more bold. And in their species, this was a major factor as the coloration of the wings showed health and it showed that they were ready to mate and they were the most prized out there. The brighter colors like blue, red, sometimes green, this was all something that made them more attractive to others. Their bodies also seemed to get a bit more aerodynamic, yet it was strange. There was a noticeable uptick in power. Though they had the larger wings, it seems they didn't have any problem moving them at all. And in fact, they moved them so fast that they had to make sure they were away from everybody, as the downdraft from pushing their wings and making sure they got to the air was enough to knock some of the smaller species over. Everybody worried about this. What the hell was going on? They looked over the squid and thought maybe they are the only ones to miss out, but no. The few that got in were already a smooth species, of course. But the main adjustments were in the increase of muscle density and much more control over both tails, very similar to the slick. This surprised the hell out of everyone. And you can say that such things don't exactly go unnoticed by all the species government. Those governments in particular began begging for additional testing from the humans. And the humans immediately noticed the danger of this, as everybody was way too interested. So they simply said no. Unfortunately, the boldness and audacity, and in some cases desperation of the species, made it so that arguments would go back and forth in Senate meetings until the human representatives standing there in their protective suits reached a frustration saturation and finally demanded a time to talk and did not want to be interrupted, and the time was of course given. He stood up, raised the visor so they could at least see his eyes, and he said, "We are not property. Understand this. Our species has been recognized as a sentient species with its own rights of self-determination and government, along with self-preservation. To demand that we surrender our autonomy, our hard-won culture, to be nothing more than your what? Your narcotic, your playthings, your experiments, your slaves, is an insult we will not tolerate. As a sign of peace and friendship, we will allow this insult to pass, as long as such suggestions, demands, or orders are never mentioned again in this council. We do recommend that research be continued until the underlying cause is found. Yet this Senate must understand fully that we are not who we were in centuries past. Understand it well." At that point, the conversation was dropped and they moved on to other business. However, it was only about 70 Earth hours before a majority of the species representatives came into the council, either flying or walking or however, and ushered and make sure the doors were secure before they spoke. Before they did, the human delegation seemed a bit nervous, as such a movement did not go unnoticed. The group stood tall as the magistrate of the council was told something. It was a whisper in his ear. No one could hear it. Even though the magistrate looked nervous, she turned and looked at all the species standing, and then turned and walked away from the podium, leaving a slick to address the room. After assuring that the magistrate was down and no one was going to interrupt them, they simply raised up and said, "A majority of this council has decided on the next course of action. As we are now well aware, the physical and mental changes to our personnel have become so pronounced that it is undeniable. We were informed that such effects would only affect potential offspring. Yet, now, this has been produced. More effects on the individual. Instead of this effect has culminated in the transformation of many of our peoples. This effect has not only changed them physically, but mentally as well. With such positive effects, we have decided that humanity must be divided amongst the species of the Senate. They will then be used to increase the efficiency of each member as to not upset the balance we have, and that may lead to another conflict if it so does. No species desires to end up on an empty seat like the Nepaltix." It then motioned towards the empty seat that remained empty since the avian species was annihilated in a multi-front war not too long ago. He continues, "As we have already noted by the majority of those standing, we ask that this be a peaceful transformation of territory and authority. What say you, human ambassadors?" As they all seem to turn and look at the humans. The humans are still standing there in those bulky suits, which are reminiscent of the ones used by the astronauts in the late 1960s, those who actually pretended that they actually reached Earth's satellite. The purpose of the suit was to block the heat of them, and to make sure they weren't seen, also to block the smell, so of course the suits would be a little bulky, but this was also a play to show everyone that they have not reached a certain tech level, at least to show that. The primary human ambassador stood up so he could be heard. Then he said, "We warned you not to even suggest such a thing. We are going to propose the construction of a station on our own borders for our own species to mingle without these suits. A chance to allow any changes to happen slowly and naturally. And it appears that you all have decided to make humanity an enemy instead of an ally. You must understand, in our history, our long history, we have fought many wars to either end such practices that you insist on at this moment, freeing ourselves from such dictatorship, or to halt it entirely from becoming a commonality altogether. We have fought for a long time to assure that our new society is free from such things, and we will not return to it. For our own self-preservation, humanity will now return to its own borders and will become its own free and independent state once again. Any species attempting to enter unwelcome will be told to leave. If you come with violent intent, you will never leave." The alien ambassador laughing at this idea as everyone seemed to chuckle at the threats from such a new species. "Human ambassador, do you think for a moment that your 6 sectors can stand up to the combined might of our forces?" He began to remove his suit as he spoke. "For us humans, living in bondage is tantamount to death. We have an old phrase for such things. It's better to live on your feet than die on your knees." With that, the suit falls to the ground with a complete flop. The humans all stand defiant in very little clothing that everyone expects them to be in as they clutch hidden weapons that had been held underneath the suits. The aliens seem to chuckle at the idea of such primitive weapons being held to protect themselves. "Do you believe those primitive weapons frighten us?" One human leveled his pulse rifle and fired the mini railgun slug into the wall next to the Slick at the podium. The Slick turned to see the hole in the wall and said, "You missed." "Did I now?" the human said. Then, a moment later, the ceremonial shawl that was draped across one shoulder of the Slick seemed to simply fall to the floor. The one button that was holding it on was no longer there. It had been shot clean off. The human that fired a shot then turned his weapon straight towards the alien ambassador and said, "I can shoot the dick off a fly at 300 meters. Should I aim for your head next?" As he said that, a human hand reached up, put it on top of the weapon to lower it slowly. The human ambassador then said, "We have made our point, I'm sure. Now listen close. The heat you feel from us is not just the fact that we are homeothermic, not at all. It's also our bioenergy." Everyone looked confused, but he continued. "We humans radiate an electrical field similar to our planet. This field, if not grounded, builds up and is discharged into those we touch that are grounded. This is the heat that you all feel." Everyone looked confused, but understanding at the same time as the human ambassador continued. "Somehow it changes the bodies of those that do not radiate heat. We're not sure how. What we do know is there's a reason why it feels warm, why you keep saying humans are so warm. It's because it's an electrical current, and electricity produces heat." He paused at that point to let the room digest the information a bit more before continuing. "We, as in all of humanity, refuse to simply become your batteries. You can go lick a 9-volt if you so choose to get the same pulse, but we will never submit. We will die with our finger on the trigger if we have to." With that, the alien ambassador stood a bit taller, even though they didn't pause to reach that shawl that was on the ground. "That was a very passionate speech. However the ruling stands, you and your species will submit. In that moment, the human ambassador motions with his head, just the slightest little bit, and the ambassador and his colleagues circle around back to back with their weapons focus out. You dare to defy us? The alien ambassador screamed. The humans simply said, We're leaving. Before I do, I will reiterate. As I said before, we are done with all of this, and if you come to our territory, you come at your own risk. As though on cue, a ship suddenly appears on sensors and passes the massive, clear dome right above the chamber. It's so close that the gravity inside the station shakes. And then one of the humans turns and goes, That's our ride. With that, not breaking their perimeter, they slowly make their way to the human battleship that is now docking. No one dares to get close, as it's clear that the humans will in fact shoot. And it was also clear that the railgun, the pulse rifle, whatever you wanted to call it, was able to actually punch through at least one bulkhead, which means it will go through a xenohead. Once everybody was on board, the ship told the station that they're going to undock and leave. They ignored all the hails and commands to wait, and told them you got 30 seconds before we disconnect. They immediately do exactly at 30 seconds, and pull away from the system, and as soon as they get just far enough away from the station, they use the fold system and completely disappear out of sight. The council is completely flabbergasted and begins to ask each other, what are they going to do? They can't risk killing all the humans or losing a lot of equipment in order to subjugate them, as that would totally destroy their economy. For now, they can only get the humans from one place that's outside the human territories. In the academy, every human hears their device's signal and incoming message. They all begin to jump up and run for the door. Miss J is there teaching the class and asks them as they run, What is wrong? Sven, without turning, says, Class is over. John is right on his heels, and he actually yells to his fellow humans going, Guess they want to fight at the academy. Oh, I hope not. I don't want to have to take all these Xenos to school. Hello everybody, this is Syntax. Thank you so much for joining me on today's chapter. Before I go, I need to send out some quick thank yous to some of my supporters, and those would be Ava Clark, Erica Gem, and MTF Guard. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel. Everyone else, I'll see you on the next one. This is Syntax, ejecting.